Is relativism a threat to modern liberal democracies? The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre opens up his book After Virtue with as what he calls a very disquieting suggestion that maybe in some sense our whole way of talking to each other in our modern liberal democracies is threatened by the shadow of relativism. In what sense? Well, MacIntyre says that we've inherited rival moral languages. Maybe we grow up within mostly a single linguistic community, and within that community we can make sense of some of our moral claims. But within wider democratic society, it's as though we're speaking different languages entirely. And what counts as grammatical and following the rules in one of the languages doesn't have any analogous position in the other language. It doesn't follow the logic of the grammar of the other language. So to take one of his examples, MacIntyre notes that, for instance, during World War II, Truman argued that the United States was justified in dropping the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki because removing the Japanese from the Pacific theater would have cost too many American lives at the end of World War II. And so instead he said you had to look at the consequences for American lives, and you had to drop these atom bombs on civilian populations, on women and children. So what's going on here is a very deep tension, according to MacIntyre, that's emerging between our rival moral languages. On the one hand, the United States has a moral language that talks about natural rights. Think of Immanuel Kant, and when we read Immanuel Kant and his claim about absolute rights, rights as intrinsic, rights as universal. So we have kind of natural rights theories, we have Kantian theories that all hold that rights are absolute and that there are human rights that can't be violated without an action being immoral or unethical. If you're coming from that moral language and that moral framework, then the dropping of the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is clearly immoral. In fact, what precisely differentiated the United States, it was said, from the fascist regimes in Europe, is that we were the kinds of people who were not willing to drop nuclear bombs on women and children and on non-combatants. On the other hand, there's another moral language that we've inherited in contemporary America that's utilitarian, that says an action is just or unjust based on the consequences for wider happiness and utility. If you take up that moral language and that moral grammar, then it looks like you can make a case for dropping the atom bombs, as Truman in fact did on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So one and the same act can be immoral or moral depending on which moral framework you're looking through, which moral language you're speaking, which moral grammar you're adhering to. This is what MacIntyre calls the problem of incommensurability. Between rival moral languages, there are incommensurable claims. There are claims that can't be reconciled by some shared set of standards or framework. This is the kind of threat that MacIntyre thinks we experience within modern democratic liberal orders. And so he says at the very bottom of our systems of thought, at the very bottom of our moral languages, is a first move that is emotivistic. In order to select the particular language community that we are belonging to, that we are using, there's a kind of irrational leap toward the premises. Why does MacIntyre think this is the case? Well, he thinks this is the case because these rival moral languages, in their most ingenious, sophisticated forms, can be made more or less logically coherent. This is, by the way, why MacIntyre, who started out the first decades of his life as a very prominent analytic philosopher, moved away from analytic philosophy toward a very postmodern form of ancient philosophy, a weird synthesis of postmodern meta-philosophy with Aristotelianism, which we'll continue to look at in the coming weeks. But for now, what you need to see is that the reason MacIntyre abandoned analytic philosophy was because he said analytic philosophy was tremendously good at analysis, at scrutinizing conceptual logics to see whether or not an argument was valid. But the problem with these rival moral languages is that they could all be made more or less coherent, more or less analytically justified on their own terms. And yet the problem was how to decide between these languages, how to decide between these rival moral positions that were incommensurable. Another problem for MacIntyre is that people of goodwill and of intelligence could lock themselves into a particular moral language where the first move, the first assumption is, say, that utility is the goal of the good life, or that, say, willing something without contradiction, as Kant says, is the goal of a moral or good life. And so there's a second kind of relativism that MacIntyre does not take seriously and does not think is a threat. This is a kind of relativism you hear of more about in our society. This is the relativism that says every moral statement could be as true as any other moral statement. MacIntyre does not take this form of relativism to be a very serious threat, for the very same reason that he doesn't think that anyone can just say what is grammatical or ungrammatical in the English language, or the German language, or Chinese. Within a particular linguistic community, within a particular moral vocabulary, there are moves that are objectively wrong or right. Think of our study of utilitarianism or Kantianism. There are clear standards and concepts by which we can assess whether or not something really was valid according to Kant's categorical imperative. There are shared standards within utilitarianism by which you can assess, was this really the best for this particular action given the consequences for social utility? So MacIntyre doesn't think that this kind of ultra-relativism, where every statement has the same standing ethically and philosophically as every other statement, is a very serious threat. For the same reason that he doesn't think that every statement within the English language is either grammatical or ungrammatical, depending on your point of view. There's a sense in which the intersubjective theory that we hold about the English language sets standards of what's grammatical and ungrammatical that I as an individual can't opt out of. They're recognized objective standards internal to a community. The real problem is this incommensurability. That's what MacIntyre's worried about, is the threat of what you do about rival ethical, moral languages. What do we do about that? And MacIntyre says if we can't find a way to make progress between these rival languages, once you have the most sophisticated forms on the table, the forms that stand up to being, more or less analytically coherent, deductively coherent, what do you do about the analytically most rigorous form of Kantianism versus the analytically most rigorous form of utilitarianism or natural rights theory? What do you do about those rival moral languages? MacIntyre says if we can't do something about that, then our society falls into what he calls emotivism, or the view that selecting between these moral languages at bottom is just an act of emotion. It's an emotive move. And his view is that this is what Nietzsche was up to. This was Nietzsche's claim. So Nietzsche wins. The Enlightenment doesn't win. None of these Enlightenment languages win. If we can't find a way to make progress on objective, rational discussion between rival moral languages. This is in some senses the central problem of MacIntyre's ethical theory. And it's something to think about going forward. How do we speak between these moral linguistic communities with one another in such a way that we can make philosophical progress and we're not just emotively shouting, hooray for, say, Kantian rationalism or hooray for utilitarianism? And at the practical political level, how do we become a society that has a coherent way of speaking to one another so that we're not saying one and the same action is both moral and immoral, so that we're not in the awkward lurch of arguing that human beings have universal rights and yet liquidating those rights when it seems convenient for consequences, or shifting positions between moral languages so that we don't have one coherent moral framework. That's what worries MacIntyre. Nietzsche and the threat of this kind of relativism occurs at the level of rival moral languages.